I'll be blunt. The one-button rotation is everything wrong with Blizzard's current design philosophy, and I hope that you can give me enough time to explain why. Because on its surface, it looks harmless. Who cares? And in a vacuum, I'd agree, but systems do not exist in a vacuum. It's funny, ever since I returned to World of Warcraft for its patch 11.2 release, having quit over 2 years ago, I genuinely expected to get enraptured back into the game world, the exceptional gameplay and the progression treadmill. In some ways, I have been. When I'm in a flow state, grinding Mythic Plus, it still does feel wonderful to play, the best in its genre. But the moment I get knocked back into the overworld, everything else returns. There's a saying a lot of RuneScape players repeat: you never quit, you just take breaks. That to me mapped onto WoW just as much as it did OSRS, and yet, days of playtime in, I haven't connected to this world that I have grown apathetic to in the ways I expected, or even hoped. I still love Warcraft. I'm almost praying that it can draw me back in, but what I discovered after returning was disappointing to say the least. I let some of my broader criticisms of philosophy out in the What WoW Can Learn from Old School RuneScape video, wherein I deduced that much of what I found fault in is as a result of Blizzard's lack of vision, one that was made manifest by their failure to follow through with Legion's rekindled vision for the game, and eventually fell by the wayside in an effort to deliver very quick content updates that fail to drum up excitement since they are more of the same. When someone asks, I wonder what the new WoW expansion will have, I think I know the answer far before any reveal. There will be 1 or 2 minor systemic changes, such as warbands, a broader new system like delves or player-owned housing, which may or may not be forgotten depending on the day, and 8 dungeons and 1 raid that will release multiple weeks after the expansion launch. The vast majority of the game's progression will be heavily time-gated in an attempt to quote-unquote respect time by rationing out an incredibly shallow piece of content over weeks or even months that would otherwise take the better half of a weekend to complete. Ever since Blizzard took the feedback from Legion to heart, this has become standard. No long-term grinds, no long-term progression, no meaningful power growth outside of stat stick itemization and meticulously homogenized trinkets that all broadly do the same thing. If you want to play the game and do relevant content for more than a couple hours, you can either grind out arbitrary Mythic Plus points for nothing after a certain rating, or create an alt to do the very same content again, but this time you're getting items that say leather instead of mail, or cloth instead of plate, while housing virtually the same stats. This is because Blizzard has long since given up on fun, game-changing itemization and dived headfirst into balance at the expense of anything and everything RPG, and that's likely because the game is hyper-competitive at the top end, and that top end is sadly very influential of everything and everyone else. But today, all of that will fall by the wayside. While I leveled through the game again, I tried to find a way to put these feelings to words in as concise a manner as I could. What in the World of Warcraft today is a perfect example of all the issues I'm discussing and more. Around level 20 or so, the answer came slowly skidding onto my action bar, this one stupid little button. Say hello to the single button assist, or as it is colloquially known, the one button rotation, because it condenses your specialization's gameplay into a single button. It was added in the most recent patch. It cycles through your chosen specialization's rotation as Blizzard designed it. Every button press is a different ability that is generally the correct one to use at that time. It is contextually driven, meaning it registers whether you're around one or multiple mobs, and comes with a global cooldown penalty to slightly mitigate the performance of this supposedly perfect rotation. As we will soon discover, the actual performance of this button is far beyond that of the average player. On its surface, this is fine, right? There isn't an insubstantial demographic of WoW players that will benefit from it, as the YouTuber Bellular demonstrated. A majority will perform better through the use of this assistant, which theoretically makes it a net positive. Everyone has a better time. Your dungeon runs are smoother, your raids are easier. Unfortunately, it's not that simple, not in my eyes, and this pesky little button is perhaps the best example of Blizzard's total disregard for the very nature of game design. Not because the developers are incompetent, but because this is the kind of soulless problem solving that is fostered by multi-hundred employee corporations. It's antithetical to the purpose and successes of the game. The developers clearly did a pretty decent job. The button is responsive, well designed, and does as it is made to do. The existence is the issue, not the implementation. To understand why, we first need to break down what game design even means, at least in this context. In the most basic sense, game design is problem solving. Not just problems of code or theoretical concepts, but of those who do or will play the game. As a game designer, you are predicting issues within the systems you're implementing and solving for those issues prior to them being experienced, hopefully. If your game has a big enough audience, then it's equally likely that you couldn't predict everything and the players will point out, often loudly and angrily, the issue. Players are great at that. They know what's wrong and complain about it constantly. Players know the problem, but not the solution. The solution must be deduced and implemented by the developer. Where this becomes complicated is in how that solution is implemented. To analogize this, think of the players as patients at a hospital, and the developers are the doctors. The patients know they're sick, they know what hurts, but it's the doctor that must analyze the malady and diagnose a solution. A general axiom for game design being give the players what they need, not what they say they want, because what players want is to win, and a game isn't defined by beating it. Your job as a developer is to create enough engaging hurdles to make beating it satisfying and fun. Your job isn't to make it easier or faster or more convenient, and those three things are often the crux of player-driven feedback. That's why talented game devs take in that feedback and output something that improves the game, not by shortening or simplifying it, but by making it more engaging, deep, rewarding, and so on. This can sometimes come from simplification, right? But not always. Take a look at Elden Ring having shorter run-backs to difficult fights as compared to Dark Souls 1. It was an improvement to the quality of life, but that's because the boss fights are substantially more challenging overall. Imagine you're a game director in charge of an open-world RPG where players must navigate said world in an attempt to progress their character, the story, and so on. The game launches, and you're surprised to see how many players hate traversing the world you spent so long creating. They say it's boring, tedious, too large. They say the combat and moment-to-moment gameplay is great, but moving around isn't. Now imagine you have three solutions to this problem. Which one would you choose? 1. Allow players to skip traversal entirely. Now, whenever they click anywhere on the map, they are instantly zapped to that location. 2. Add more points of interest to explore between the main goals and the world. More content, more ways to experience the combat that's being received positively. And 3. Make traversal itself more engaging. Random events, cooler movement mechanics, and so on. There isn't one answer to this issue, but I hope everyone watching can agree that the first option, allowing players to navigate anywhere instantly, is not the correct thing to do. It betrays the entire purpose of creating and implementing an open world and shortens the experience by removing a large swath of content from relevancy. All it does is hone in on the element people like without addressing those they don't. It's the lazy solution. To return to the hospital analogy, it's like prescribing a patient with a broken leg a whole host of painkillers. This may alleviate their pain, but it won't solve their issue. The pain isn't the problem, it's just a symptom. By not addressing the problem, you only feign health, but in the long term, the leg doesn't heal, it deforms. The other two options are more reasonable. The second one, more exploration and combat in between, does the same thing while adding value to navigation, while the last option, the lattermost one, makes the navigation itself more fun, kind of like what you saw Blizzard do with dragon riding. These are very challenging solutions to implement, but that's what a game designer is there for. Receive the feedback that moving around the world sucks, and they wish they could do it faster, that's what the player wants, and then give them better content in response, what they need. The medical malpractice of just dishing out painkillers rather than a diagnosis is a byproduct of a lack of game design and insight. Now let's map that onto the one-button rotation. Hey, I just want to thank everyone for watching, especially my channel members who are supporting this project. If you want to become a member as well, you'll gain access to emotes, shoutouts, and even unscripted videos wherein I discuss suggested and other unfiltered topics. Thanks again, and back to the video. The problem is very simple to understand. A huge host of players think the class gameplay in WoW is too complex to learn, too difficult to harness during intense boss fights. It has become a barrier to gameplay. It's too hard, it's too complicated, and maybe it's not rewarding enough. All of these complaints are as valid as those in the navigation example above. They are true to the game as it exists right now. The developer's job would be to align what the game is with what they want it to be, and to do that, I think the correct answer is always education. Teach players, don't do it for them. Some comments on my previous WoW video were wondering why I spend so long talking about leveling. They'd say it's pointless and a tiny fraction of your overall game time. And to that, I'd agree. The leveling in retail WoW is utterly irrelevant and horribly designed. It's fundamentally broken in its scaling and strangely confusing in its implementation. It makes the game world look dead, and its bugs or inconsistencies are reminiscent of like a dying or forgotten MMO. While leveling through the old world, I got the vibes that I was playing some ancient lost artifact of yore, like those you'd see in an old Josh Strife Hayes video, not the most popular MMORPG on Earth, and that in and of itself is a huge issue. But beyond the broken scaling, unsatisfying progression, and lack of immersion due to how quickly you flit through the world, the biggest issue is Blizzard's inability to harness what they have to tutorialize the game properly. After all, in theme park MMOs, the leveling experience can be applied as a tutorial. It teaches you the basics of the game and eventually, hopefully, challenges you enough to understand the basics of your class. Take a look at, well, the exact same game. This is something that World of Warcraft wasn't just good at, it was the best at. That's what made it so popular in the first place. The evocative, trailblazing, game-changing leveling experience of vanilla and eventually classic WoW is so beloved that people are still flocking to do it again every time Blizzard relaunches another version of WoW's oldest incarnation. Sure, it's a longer journey, it's a more difficult and tedious one, but it undeniably teaches you the game. It teaches you the strengths and weaknesses of your class. You are forced to learn how to survive in a situation where you pull one too many mobs and must now escape with your heart still beating. It's the polar opposite of the game today, and my suggestion isn't to make a 150-hour leveling experience for retail, but to instead look at what elements resonated in Classic educationally and implement those. After all, Blizzard has a great reason to do that. It would be in response to the problem said above. Not enough people understand their class. Unfortunately, Blizzard has driven in the complete opposite direction. You see, there's a very clear reason why the leveling experience in retail WoW is so scuffed and stupid. It's because it isn't a thing anymore. Like, I'm genuinely not sure when Blizzard has even considered it a facet of the game. It's an option for those who already play to explore, and that's kind of it. This is because you aren't meant to do it. What you are meant to do as a new player is boost. And I'm not saying that in the generic corporate greed bad sort of way. I don't think Blizzard is even selling that many of these level boosts on their Cash App because they are $60 for what amounts to skipping a borderline AFK 8-hour grind. No, they give them away with every single expansion purchase. I got a free one with my 50% discounted War Within. As a new player, you're funneled into the hyper-narrow sliver of content that Blizzard has deemed relevant for the next 6 months to a year and a half, and this has created for some truly fascinating issues. For one, logging on, doing some half-assed shitty tutorial slapped together by an intern, and then being sent to go fight demigods is fucking lame. Like, just from a thematic standpoint, it's lame as hell and clearly catered to those who are already familiar with the basics of the game. Second, it makes every single new starting zone of an expansion feel like a tutorial, which is so bizarre. You are almost max level, yet you're being treated like a toddler learning to tie their sneakers. It's what made my first experience leveling in Khazalgar seem extra brain-dead, even more than usual. And finally, it puts Blizzard in the convenient position of being able to treat every single piece of content before the current, hyper-narrow relevant area as if it doesn't exist. If it doesn't exist, why fix it? Why bother when everyone is converged around a single point anyway? To return back to what I said originally, Blizzard has, maybe unintentionally, terraformed the perfect environment to create the issue that birthed the one-button rotation. Not because classes are too hard, they really aren't, but because nothing about the game's design bothers to even teach players how to play. Worse yet, the stupid slop of the overworld makes this issue even worse. Now, if the game world itself housed challenges that required even new players to understand incredibly simple mechanics like interrupt a cast, crowd control an ad, press the big damage button when the enemy has a shield you must break, then we could see how players choose to play. Instead, because the game is harshly split into two difficulties, nonsense goo goo gaga baby dum dum slobbering over my keyboard sucking on my binky mode, and some instanced content, there is only a narrow bridge that even exists to cross. You either need to put yourself in the position to ruin dungeon runs in an effort to get better at the game, which is understandably a turnoff to those who don't want to ruin other people's fun, or you have to do hours of external research and endless practice in hopes that it would translate to the content that demands it. If you ever wonder why the amount of people doing dungeons and raids hasn't increased proportionally, it's because of this. Not because players are too toxic and everyone playing WoW has an anxiety disorder, but because the environment Blizzard has fostered is one where there is far too much friction present between, in quotes, playing the game and actually playing the game. To be honest, it's cope to think that Blizzard puts even a fraction of the effort into these dogshit world events and barely functioning world quests as they do their raids and dungeons, and yet the largest demographic of players, those who don't do dungeons and raids, are gaslit into thinking that what they're experiencing is even remotely the intended design. All of this is the side attraction of a side attraction, and quite frankly, it's insulting. How many patches must launch in a barely functioning state where the copy-paste quests still somehow bug while functionally not changing in design for the better part of 2 decades until people realize that this shit is not Blizzard's priority, and if it is, then they've done a piss-poor job of showing it. Let me be even harsher for a moment while I'm mid-crash out. This overworld nonsense is about as conceptually engaging as chopping a tree in RuneScape for 50 hours. I mean, at least in RuneScape you get some sense of horizontal progression and agency-driven decision-making from doing so. In WoW, you get a UI pop-up saying you've completed achievements or got a recolor of existing items and mounts to populate another piece of UI you are likely to never see or use, because a 17th recolor of a questing set obtained by logging in once every week for 10 minutes and AFKing an event isn't particularly engaging or rewarding. At least the unengaging content in old-school RuneScape can either be passive or yield properly impactful rewards in the future. Here, it's nonsense. It's, and I hate this word, slop. But slop is how I describe a vast majority of WoW's overworld activities. It's genuinely sad that the most popular MMORPG on Earth is not able to be as engaging as a gacha game in its open world. You have a game with, to me, unquestionably the best talent trees in the genre, the best class design in the genre, the best combat in the genre, and yet what the majority of players are meant to do is this? Now you can argue that's because it's respecting your time by being so shit that you want to never do it, that's fine, but that's also nonsensical game design. A game isn't supposed to repel, it's supposed to engage. This entire genre is defined by persistence in both its world and those who exist in it. That's what an MMO is. While waiting on my weekly Nightfall event, which by the way didn't even work when it launched, I had a thought. This piece of content gives you a weekly token that you can use to purchase borderline useless gear, armors and weapons that are recolors of an existing gear set. Meaning that if you want to obtain it, you need to log on every week for around 10 to 15 weeks. Which isn't actually true, by the way. You see, you can actually obtain this recolor as a random drop from the Nightfall itself, but that isn't reflected in the UI that was created to tell you where you can get certain items. The fact that there's an entire section of this cosmetics tab created to tell you the basics of where to obtain something, yet it actually doesn't reflect the real information accurately. I mean, there are over 500 employees working on World of Warcraft. 500. That's all I'm gonna say. Regardless, I employed some of my social skills to ask whether it actually would take 15 weeks to unlock this set. After being told that I could only obtain it once per week, which again isn't true, I said something akin to, "Wow, I wish I could just grind it out. That's kind of lame. A random recolor cosmetic is time-gated by more than 2 months. And I was straight up flamed, because that's the prevailing attitude amongst those who still play WoW. At least that's my impression. Having the game deliver optional, brain-dead, rehashed content endlessly is preferable to having a game where they can't progress at an expedited rate or fall behind due to not being able to commit enough time to play. When you spend the past 10 years prescribing mass amounts of painkillers to your patients, eventually they either stop coming to you or become addicted. Again, this is partly Blizzard's fault for fostering a game and community that operates on time-gated 6-month increments where every new patch renders everything before it borderline irrelevant, so players feel rushed to play, and when Blizzard gives open-ended grinds like the artifact weapons in Legion, it becomes very FOMO-driven. So in response, Blizzard triples down on seasonality and short-form progression, but extends the overwhelming presence of time gating because they understand that they need to have people playing the new patch more than 1 week after it launches. Everything even semi-meaningful in WoW is time-gated, everything. I can't even grind a shitty reputation from a patch ago or 2 patches ago that gives irrelevant gear just for a recolored cosmetic without being told to log off or go play an alt or a different game, which is what I did, eventually discovering OSRS because yeah, once you actually play a game that allows you to set your own schedule while playing, you kind of realize how in an effort to respect time, Blizzard has unintentionally created a fucking work schedule for you, where you sit in traffic alongside hundreds of other players, clock into your shift, complete it for a pittance, and log off, go home. The reason I bring all of this up in relation to the one-button rotation is because this design philosophy employed by Blizzard is pervasive. It extends to every single corner of the game. It's not just in its leveling or in its tutorializing or in its dungeons, it's everywhere. In fact, when my friend and I discovered this hard mode delve boss, it almost felt like a mistake, like someone forgot to remove it from the game. Up until this point, every delve felt like total slop, an endless cycle of samey enemies dealt with through a static AoE rotation. But now, here's a scalable encounter that's genuinely quite hard, taking us 20 or so attempts to finally beat, and as a result, is really fun. For an hour of my day, I remembered why I love retail WoW. Here's me doing my rotation while perfecting these mechanics and doing so alongside my friend. What a cool and inspired challenge that, and it gave me a cosmetic headpiece. You see, I just put in more effort than I had at any other point playing the game since returning, and for that, I get a cosmetic headpiece, one which is actually an identical recolor of another cosmetic headpiece. Because such a large portion of this game's player base is unable to do this content, yet feels like they must earn its reward, Blizzard isn't allowed to put something actually interesting or novel behind this boss. It requires you to play the game somewhat well, and Blizzard hasn't developed enough content to bridge the gap between brain off and somewhat well, so those who aren't familiar with their class won't ever do it. That's where the one-button rotation comes in though, right? Now they can, and they too can earn this cosmetic slop. But that's the other issue. You developed an autoplay feature, yet the difficult content that is meant to become more accessible still rewards nothing. And that's because this is a Trojan horse solution. It isn't real, and it's not solving for anything other than giving a more brain-dead way to AFK overworld slop. World of Warcraft's best feature is its gameplay. That's kind of the one area Blizzard still excels at. The class design is really great in WoW. The new talent trees, as I've said, are the best in the entire genre. The fights and their mechanics are really cool and thematic and can be demanding on the appropriate difficulties. It's obvious the amount of care put into developing these exceptional features. So why are they so against teaching players them? I'm sure there is some kind of corporate lawyer-speak answer to this, where they refer back to the single father of 97 children who has 12 minutes a week to play, benefiting from being able to not do the fun stuff, but honestly, I don't buy it, not for a second. Not when Elden Ring sold 30 million copies and has a far steeper barrier to entry. Now, I could be wrong, and in a few years we may see WoW evolve in its gameplay, but this patchwork band-aid fix further dulls the elements that are most standout, and I think that's because Blizzard is terrified of demanding players do anything. It seems as though the players that still play don't really want to do anything either. And why would they? You've conditioned them to operate through weekly checklists and incrementally scaling items that cease to offer anything even remotely thought-provoking. Time and time again, you've demonstrated that everything they've earned over the last 6 months will be replaced by questing greens or mythic dungeon loot within a week, except the 57 recolors of a cloak or 20 recolors of a single new mount model. That's kind of the only thing that stays with you after the final patch hits, and we go from killing goblins in a casino to slaying an interdimensional planet-eating void god. You, as developers, have Stockholmed your player base into believing that cool items with actual identities are bad for balance. There's a reason the only memorable drops in the past 15 years have been 1 or 2 exceptional trinkets per expansion that break away from the hyper-curated, overly balanced and homogenized pack. Or weapons with powerful effects that Blizzard has seemingly forgot to tune and dull until they became more of the same. I'm not sure what I expected. Of course, people are going to feel precious about cosmetic slop. That's the only thing they can permanently keep. And now the game presents a much simpler avenue for mastery, because this one-button rotation is more than able to clear heroic difficulty, and as someone who was rated cutting edge for many years prior to quitting, heroic is kind of where the game should end, and as much as I enjoy the first half of Mythic rating, it's very niche in no small part due to how lacking in rewards it is. Blizzard can't fathom giving anything tangible to people who do the hardest difficulty, so they default to a chance at a mount, some achievements no one will ever care about, a title no one will ever notice, and the same exact gear you've already been earning except slightly scaled up and rendered just as useless when the next patch drops. Other than the communality of doing something with equally sweaty players or some inherent competitive spirit, the impetus for mythic raiding is borderline non-existent, which is why the scene, as with the game, hasn't grown at all. In fact, judging by the world first race numbers, it's shrunk. Less people care, because that's the attitude Blizzard caters to. Why should you care? It's not like you'll get anything meaningful out of doing it yourself, or aspiring to do it eventually. Stick to your one-button rotation so you can focus on the mechanics of moving slightly right or slightly left or pressing the interrupt button. Stick to idling during the world events or spamming your AoE rotation in delves, and find solace in knowing that the people who spend far more time than you and put in far more effort than you aren't rewarded with anything even tangibly different or unique. In fact, even their more impressive power will be rendered mute in a couple months. Don't worry, eventually you'll be back on equal footing once again. All of this is not the player's fault for feeling. Blizzard has simply shaved away the kinds of emotions that would be fostered by a more evocative, RPG-centric environment, where personal theory crafting is augmented by guides rather than totally replaced by them. Teaching players how to play your game requires a gentle hand and foresight. It is incredibly difficult to do well, and for as much as I glaze Jagex and old school RuneScape for being substantially better systemically than World of Warcraft, for being far more engaged with its community, for being more responsive to change, more conscious of its game's vision and identity, it also doesn't deliver a good starting experience for its first-time players. I made a whole video on that actually. It's a far more complex game than WoW, but it faces similar struggles in its onboarding. But damn, at least Jagex is trying. At least they are implementing novel onboarding features and early game content that pushes players to understand its complexities. At least they aren't filing down the demand. In fact, they are increasing it. By improving onboarding, they are adding more difficult content earlier in the game. New, super early game bosses like Scurious that teach basics of movement and prayer switching are substantially more demanding than any other piece of early game content that existed before it, and yet is incredibly popular because it shows people what there is to learn and interests them with good outputs and unique mechanics. As we all know, Jagex has been rewarded for this, seeing substantial game growth over the past 2 years. Instead of looking at the player retention rate of early game and opting to remove all friction, they doubled down on the friction that works. Now, one could argue that's because RuneScape has already failed as a result of trying that, but it's worth considering nevertheless. You will only ever learn something if there is an impetus to do so, a demand. That's part of the joy millions find in the Dark Souls series. It's failing, being lost, confused and broken, yet pushing forward until the final swing of your Zweihander severs the monster's head from their second head or something. For as obtuse as old school RuneScape can be, especially in their older quests, something I always appreciated is how much they actually ask of you. The fact that there are genuinely challenging encounters in quests is frankly alien to the MMO space. It's not often that a quest monster can straight up one-shot you if you're not careful, and being careful requires introspection and understanding of what you can and can't do, what abilities you do and don't have. It promotes theory crafting. It makes you connect to your character after you log off because you continue thinking about the game. It doesn't just default to connections that are reliant on making them look pretty in a cosmetic outfit. It's why I love the OSRS player housing model, even though it lacks the visual fidelity and customizability of other MMOs, because I actually go there for a reason. Making my house functional is a cosmetic reward, yes, but more importantly, an actual reward too. More quality of life from teleports to cheaper armor repairs. My fear is that in Blizzard's attempt to retain their pre-existing demographic of players, they are too afraid of generating the friction of demanding them do something they otherwise wouldn't be comfortable with. They feel like they can't push players out of their comfort zones and promote new kinds of engagements that showcase the parts of the game they put the most effort into. As I said earlier, game design is about placing hurdles and giving a reason to leap over them. Blizzard has had the same hurdles placed for a decade now. They have long since rusted over, becoming a tetanus hazard. Instead of polishing them or offering a more substantial reward at the finish line, they've settled with simply allowing players to avoid them altogether.